Hi, I'm Jeff Sharon from UCF Sports Night. You can now watch UCF TV 24 hours a day on Bright House Digital Channel 1.
Thank you very much, Marta, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming. And it's great to be back here. I was here for a lecture, I think just this time last year, and usually when I give a lecture someplace, I'm not invited back. and so I'm especially grateful to Paolo and Umberto and all the people involved in sponsoring this event, for having, wanted a second. Also, after this afternoon, I'm not sure how much more you want to know about me. You've heard about my house, the deer, my children, but you're going to have to hear, half an hour more. Not half an hour, but some more. Yes, I'm going to. You've also been hearing a lot about the hyphen, and what happens when you get older is that the hyphen, like other parts of your body, begins to sag, right? It is no longer as taut or as firm as it was when you were young. And when the hyphen sags, sometimes it becomes a wrinkle, sometimes it becomes a scar. And so this is sort of the general theme of my talk, the sagging, life on the sagging hyphen. But more specifically, the title of my talk was suggested by that of a well-known book, a book by Ana Luisa Centella called Growing Up Bilingual. It's really a classic study of Puerto Rican kids from New York growing up. And a few months ago, I was looking at Centella's book in connection with my course on Latino literature. By the way, can everybody hear me? Sometimes my voice doesn't carry. Yeah? Okay. So a few months ago, I was looking at this book, Growing Up Bilingual, in connection with my course on Latino literature that I'm teaching this semester, when I realized that almost all of the books I had put on my syllabus had to do with children or adolescents. Books like The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros, American Chica, a memoir by Maria Rana Ward, When I Was Puerto Rican by Esmeralda Santiago, Hunger of Memory, Richard Rodriguez, Drown by young Dominican writer Junot Diaz, and one of the classics of Latino literature, which is How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents by Julia Alvarez. And this emphasis on the young carries over into other books on Latinos that echo Ana Luisa Centella's title. For example, there's a book called Growing Up Latino, one called Growing Up Hispanic, Growing Up Puerto Rican, Growing Up Chicano, Growing Up in the Barrio. To judge from these and similar works, it would seem that we Hispanics have found the fountain of youth that Ponce de Leon was searching for not too far from here. Indeed, up to now, the dominant narrative type in the imaginative writing of U.S. Hispanics has been the coming-of-age story. Narratives focused on adolescents struggling with their bifurcated cultural heritage. Even when a novel features older protagonists, as does Oscar Hijuelos' The Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love, the story is filtered through the eyes of an adolescent. In this instance, the Mambo King's nephew, whose name is Eugenio, and, as his name Eugenio suggests, he is the source, the genitor, of the account. As Marta mentioned, years ago I published a memoir called Next Year in Cuba, and the book's subtitle, which was added by the publisher that she also mentioned, was A Cubano's Coming of Age in America. It's not difficult to understand why an emergent literature, a literature that is itself coming of age, would gravitate toward coming-of-age stories. It seems reasonable that such a literature should find its way through characters who are themselves maturing, advancing toward adulthood, and, in most instances, toward assimilation. In this respect, Latino literature as a whole draws a broad allegory about its own becoming. It is also well to remember that Although Hispanics have been growing up in this country for centuries, it was not until 1980 that the US Census actually began to use the term Hispanic. And it was roughly around the same time that Latino literature started to infiltrate the curricula of English departments. Since for the most part, these works were written by second-generation Hispanics who had grown up in the 1960s and 1970s, the voice that speaks in them tends to be that of a biculturally sensitive, English-dominant adolescent or young adult who attempts to bridge the distance between countries and cultures. That is why the protagonist of Cristina Garcia's Dreaming in Cuban, another one of Latino literature's greatest hits, and that's why the protagonist of Dreaming in Cuban is named Pilar Puente. She is the pillar, Pilar, that sustains the narrative, as well as the bridge, the puente, between the old world and the new. But enough about youth. This afternoon, and with apologies to all the young people in the audience, including Professor Garcia and Dean Fernandez, so this afternoon I want to think old, or at least I want to think about the old, by speaking to you of a different coming of age that to me is a real coming of age. I mean to say, the coming of old age. After all, Maria Arana's American Chica is by now an American Vieja. The Garcia girls, who lost their accents back in the 1960s, are now losing their teeth. And Richard Rodriguez's hunger of memory has begun to manifest itself in so-called senior moments. Still, the popularity of coming-of-age story seems not to wane. A few months ago, Julia Alvarez published a new book. Its title, Once Upon a Quinceañera, Coming of Age in the USA. As most of you know, a quinceañera is a 15-year-old Hispanic girl, and that's when she makes her debut in society. So Once Upon a Quinceañera. Now, even if it sometimes seems that Hispanics never grow up, we do grow up, and then, if we're lucky, we grow old. So my subject is, as I said before, aging on the hyphen, how the onset of age inflects, perhaps infects, the hyphenate writer's work. An alternate title for my talk will have been, Once Upon a Cincuentón. A cincuentón being Cuban old geezer. Yours truly. So Once Upon a Cincuentón, later in life on the hyphen. More concretely, I'm interested in what the passage of time does to our languages, to our tongues. As we get older, do we forget to use our tongues? Or do we make up for other losses and diminishments by growing ever more skilled with them? How different is the slick tongue of a quinceañera from the slack tongue of a cincuentón? And speaking of slackness, what about the complicated nexus between desire and language, eros and logos? How does that change over time? In a poem entitled Dulzura, Sandra Cisneros asks her lover, make love to me in Spanish, not with that other tongue. The switch in prepositions from in Spanish to with that other tongue signals how quickly tongues allow us to glide from wordplay to foreplay. Does that gliding become smoother or rougher as we get older? Now, as Professor Carrabeta, I'm pronouncing it correctly, thank you, as he explained very well this morning, language is much more than a medium for communication. In Spanish, when one knows a language well, one is said to dominate it, no? Domina el español, domina el inglés. But I think my mother tongue has it backwards. However articulate we may be, however large our vocabularies, we don't dominate a language. If anything, the language dominates us. It is language that determines the domain, the dominion, and we as speakers cannot but submit to its territorial imperatives. A language tells us what we can and cannot say, think, and feel in ways of which we are not even aware. Language acts are acts of identity. To a large extent, we are what we speak. In The American Scene, the novelist Henry James remarks that a person's, quote, supreme relation, his supreme relation is to his homeland. But James's own life shows that his attachment to the English language was stronger than his allegiance to the United States. It may be that a person's strongest, most enduring attachment is to his language, or rather to his tongue. For a tongue is language incarnate, language made flesh, language as a body part, an organ as well as a faculty. Although no language can match the looseness of a tongue, tongues tie in ways that languages never do. It is also well to keep in mind that a bilingual's relation to his languages is not symmetrical. In the poem I quoted a few moments ago, Cisneros asks for a tenderness that she can only feel in Spanish, a sweetness that only exists as dulzura. When she asks to be loved in Spanish, she's looking for another self, a secret self, someone she used to be, or maybe someone she never was. That's why I'm skeptical, very skeptical, of what's sometimes called balanced bilingualism. Even among those who have been raised bilingually, the way Cisneros was, the relation of languages is usually not balanced. The notion of a balanced bilingualism, or equilingüismo, as it is sometimes called in Spanish, is as much of a pedagogical fiction as that of a bilingualism without pain. Elsa Triolet, a francophone Russian writer, used to complain, "I am sick with bilingualism." The Chicana writer Sherry Moraga puts it this way, "Words are a war to me." Whether a burden or a blessing, bilingualism is profoundly and even mysteriously personal. And no small part of its mystery has to do with how well or how poorly our tongues age, with how they change over time. With time, a foreign language could well evolve into a conjugal tongue. The sounds that cradled us in infancy could haunt us in adulthood. When we are learning a language, whether in the classroom or the bedroom, our relation with the new language is constantly evolving. Every new word we learn, every new sentence we utter, changes our relation with that language. As we get older, this process continues. We never stop learning our languages, and we never stop forgetting them. It's a little bit like an endless courtship. We are permanent suitors of language, never turned down and yet never accepted. A language twirls us around her little finger, and happily or unhappily, we have no choice but to stay twirled. Take the case of the Franco-Argentine, or perhaps I should say French-Argentine, so as not to shortchange the French part, although the French deserve to be shortchanged, so. Take the case of the Franco-Argentine writer Héctor Bianchotti, who was born in Córdoba, and I hope I'm pronouncing his last name properly, Bianchotti, who was born in Córdoba, Argentina in 1930. Even though his Italian immigrant parents spoke the Piedmontese dialect at home and with each other, they always spoke to their children in Spanish and actually insisted that their children speak only Spanish. For this reason, Bianchotti believes that he never had a true mother tongue. For him, Spanish was at best a stepmother tongue, a substitute for the real thing. The real thing would have been the forbidden Piedmontese dialect. Bianchotti lived in Argentina until he was 25, and then he left for Europe. After spending several years in Spain, he settled permanently in France in 1961 when he was about 30 years old. Over the next 20 years, while residing in Paris, Bianchotti would write and publish 5 novels in Spanish. But in 1982, after turning 50 and becoming a naturalized French citizen, something happened. He began to write fiction in French, and his first novel in French appeared a couple of years later. Once he began writing fiction in French, Bianchotti stopped writing in Spanish altogether. He even stopped speaking it. To this day, he refuses to be interviewed in Spanish, for example. For the last 25 years, he has enclosed himself inside what he calls the, quote, delicate labyrinth of the French language. His career as a Francophone writer culminated with his election in 1996 to the Académie Française. And he was, I believe he was the first Latin American-born writer so honored. Bianchotti has talked about, so this is a guy who got to France when he was 30 years old. At the time, he could read French, but he had never spoken it and had never written it. And he began to learn it little by little. And actually, he got a job writing readers' reports for Gallimard, which is a very important French publishing house. And he says he taught himself to write French by writing readers' reports on Spanish novels that they were considering for translation. And then, but continued to write fiction in Spanish for 20 years. And then in the early 80s, 82 or so, he suddenly stopped writing fiction in Spanish and began writing fiction in French. And he's talked about his switch from Spanish to French in several interviews, as well as in his Francophone novels. Most of his novels are autobiographical. He calls them autofiction, thinking he actually thought he had invented the term, but actually some professor at NYU, I believe, Dubrovsky, invented the term autofiction. But they're basically thinly disguised autobiographical novels. For example, in a 1990 interview, Bianchotti explained that his Spanish had deteriorated to the point that he could no longer write in Spanish, even if he wanted to. As he put it, quote, "I am not sure that French has accepted me, but I know for certain that Spanish has abandoned me." Surprisingly, at least surprisingly to me, less than 10 years after he stopped writing in Spanish, Bianchotti feels himself to be essentially tongueless. One language has abandoned him, while the other has not accepted him. I think Bill Deaver earlier was talking about, used the term nilingue, right, as opposed to bilingue. Bianchotti subjectively feels himself to be basically nilingue, no? Ni francés, ni español, no? Not neither one of his two languages. But since Bianchotti to this day speaks French with a thick Argentine accent, it is not really true that Spanish has entirely abandoned him. Linguists tell us that among adult learners of a second language, the most persistent type of linguistic interference is phonological. Paradoxical as it may seem, it is easier to learn a language's grammar, however complicated, than it is to produce its sounds. We can forget all the words of our first language, and yet our tongue remains tuned to its music. Thus Bianchotti, who is regarded as a consummate stylist in French, cannot properly pronounce the words with which he crafts his crystalline sentences. Some years later, in another interview, Bianchotti made the striking observation that a writer's two muses are nostalgia and remorse. I think that there's a connection between this statement and his earlier statement of linguistic unhousedness. For nostalgia and remorse may well be the byproducts of his switch in languages. When Bianchotti looks back to his youth, as he does in his French novels, he is not only looking back to another time and another place, he is looking back to another language. When he reconstructs his childhood in Córdoba, the act of recollection entails an exercise in translation. By recalling in French a life that unfolded in Spanish, he is making all the more evident his distance from that life. Bianchotti's nostalgia is not only for people and places, but for sounds, sounds to which he has made himself deaf, hence, perhaps, the remorse. For the hyphenate writer who engages in the remembrance of things past, the discomfort of expressing himself in a language that is not his own increases rather than decreases with age. His degree of fluency or his record of achievement in the second language does not do nothing to diminish his unease, for its origins are not linguistic but lingual. They are tied to a tongue rather than to a language. Although Bianchotti says that he never had a mother tongue, I don't quite believe him. And I suspect that this statement may be a way of muffling his remorse at having abandoned Spanish, which was in effect his mother tongue. It is true, at least, that he thinks of writing in French as illicit or shady, comparing it often to a kind of contraband. For example, in his acceptance speech at the Académie Française, he says that he entered the French language, quote, through the paths of smugglers. The last book Bianchotti ever published in Spanish It's a book called El amor no es amado. Loved is not beloved. And it was published in 1983. And this book includes a story called La Barca en el Neckar, the boat on the Neckar River. The Neckar is a river in Germany. And the story takes place in the 1960s, and the narrator is a 65-year-old man who works as a porter in the same building where he lives in Paris. After this man's wife dies, the old man has nothing to do except spend his time straightening out the garbage cans, sweeping the stairs, watering the plants, and remembering. 20 years earlier, he had been part of the German occupation of the German forces that occupied Paris during World War II. When he was there, he fell in love with this French woman, whom he eventually married, and deserted from the German forces and stayed in France. Now that his wife has passed away, the old man lies awake in his basement apartment and thinks back to his youth in Germany, when his ambition had been to become a poet, to become another Helderling, as he says. Recalling his other life, he realizes that his native tongue has slipped away from him, and with it, the young man he used to be. For that young man was inseparable from the language that he spoke. As he puts it, yo no poseía ya mi idioma. El alma del muchacho había muerto. I no longer possessed my language. The soul of the boy had died. As it happens, although the story was published in Spanish, it was originally written in French. In fact, The Boat on the Neckar River was Bianchotti's first piece of fiction in French. This suggests that the old man is Bianchotti's metaphor for the writer who abandons his mother tongue for another tongue. It does not matter that in the story, the childhood language was replaced by a conjugal tongue. The old man's status as a deserter makes clear Bianchotti's mixed feelings about the switch. As a kind of valedictory to Spanish, Bianchotti's inaugural performance in French not only makes evident his nostalgia for Spanish, a proleptic nostalgia, a nostalgia avant la lettre, as it were, since at this point Bianchotti had not yet published any fiction in French, but it also shows the emotional toll extracted by the abandonment of a first language. At one point, the deserter muses to himself. He thinks, now my conduct makes me ashamed, and I ask myself, why did I have to become a deserter? Although I would never pretend to compare myself to Bianchotti, Bianchotti is a real writer, no, he's a great writer, and I'm just an interloper, no, I don't know. In Cuban would say un guillado, no, sort of like a con guy. So anyway, although I'm not implying any commensurability in talent or achievement, his portrait of the aging bilingual writer comports with my own experience. Like his deserter, I too feel nostalgia for my mother tongue and remorse that I have not done more of my writing and perhaps my living in Spanish. Sometimes I have even thought that every single one of my English sentences, including this one, hides the absence of the Spanish sentence that I wasn't willing or able to write. And if I handle English more or less well, it is because I want to write such clear, clean prose that no one will miss the Spanish that it replaces and that it can never replace. I would not be surprised if a similar ambition lay behind Bianchotti's burnished French prose. The person I am closest to is an American woman. The person who had the biggest impact on my life and to whom I was never close was a Cuban man. The language of my inner discourse, the taunts and endearments I whisper only to myself, is shaped by these and other tongue ties. While I talk to myself, both in Spanish and English, when I hear Spanish voices in my head, they are usually male. When I hear English voices, they are usually female. For me, English is a loving and accessible she tongue. Spanish, a distant but beloved he tongue. The older I get, the fainter the whispers of Spanish become, but also the more insistent. For most of my adult life, the language I have felt uneasy about has been Spanish, not English. My birth tongue, not my adopted language. Criticize my English and your words will never hurt me. criticize my Spanish, and you're undermining me, my deepest convictions and theories about myself. If you want to hurt me, writes Gloria Ansaldúa, talk badly about my language. For me, that language is Spanish. There's an I Love Lucy episode. Remember the I Love Lucy series back in the 1950s with a ditzy American redhead married to the Cuban band leader, Ricky Ricardo? Well, there's an I Love Lucy episode in which Lucy hires an English tutor to improve Ricky's pronunciation. At this point in the series, Lucy is pregnant with the person that's going to become little Ricky, you know? And she's afraid that their son will pick up his father's terrible English pronunciation. And so the English tutor, this guy, the English tutor, a man called Mr. Livermore, and he's sort of a stuffy, bow-tied pedant with an affected pronunciation and a hysterical aversion to slang. During the first lesson, Mr. Livermore instructs his class, and of course the class is not only Ricky, the class is also Lucy and then Fred and Ethel. They're next door neighbors, no? And in the first class, he instructs them on the correct pronunciation of the English vowels. Unlike his classmates, who imitate Livermore's fastidious pronunciation well enough, Ricky pronounces the vowels in Spanish. A, E, I, O, U. Mr. Livermore can't believe his ears. Stunned, he turns to Ricky. Mr. Ricardo, he says, wherever did you acquire that odd pronunciation? And Ricky replies, I'm Cuban. What's your excuse? Well, I'm Cuban too. And so to the Mr. Livermores of my life, to those who may criticize my English, I can always reply, I'm Cuban. What's your excuse? But I cannot dispose of criticisms of my Spanish so lightly. According to E.M. Cioran, a Romanian who wrote both in Romanian and French, our mother tongue is the only one in which we have a right to make mistakes. But for those of us who tie our identity to our nationality, as exiles often do, and our nationality to our tongue, to our language, as exiles also do, exactly the opposite is true. Our mother tongue is the one language in which we cannot make mistakes. Since a crucial component of our self-image is the idea we have of ourselves as language users, one of the most disabling forms of self-doubt arises from the conviction that we cannot speak our language well enough, our native language well enough. In my Spanish classes, I have witnessed this fear many times in students of Hispanic background. I have seen how they squirm and look away when I call on them, when they think I think they should speak like natives. I have often squirmed and looked away myself, feeling that no matter how good my Spanish may be, it's just not good enough, not what it should be for someone born in Cuba. As I have gotten older, I have become more willing to admit in public to mother tongue separation anxiety. I think I have gained a better understanding of its causes and occasions, and my lingual superego, my Spanish conciencia, treats me less harshly than it used to. At the same time, like Bianchotti's old man, I have also become more aware of the void created by the absence of Spanish. Some years ago, when I turned 50, my American life wasn't going all that well, and moreover, I had used up all of my English words. And so I decided that it wasn't too late to reach out and back to my mother tongue, and so I wrote a little book in Spanish about Spanish, a combination language proficiency test and belated love poem. And that's the book that Humberto and Bill referred to, the 50 Lecciones, my book I wrote when I turned 50. And the book itself is sort of the history, sort of the imaginary history of one afternoon when I turned 50, and I hold myself up in my study in my house in North Carolina and begin by changing the names of everything around me, because up to that point things that I had a reading chair. So my reading chair became butacón, and the oak outside my window became un roble, and the deer became venados, and then I decided to sort of make an island in that little study and write this book in Spanish, where I tried to sort of learn again for the first time what it was like to write in Spanish. And at the end, I come out of my study, and as Bill mentioned, I And then, the kids are outside with Marianne, my wife, lighting a birthday and singing Apio Verde, which, by the way, Apio Verde is a parody that I learned as a kid in Cuba of Happy Birthday. And we used to say Apio Verde to you, Apio Verde to you. So, I mean, it's actually a Cuban thing, Anyway, so, and that's a book that I'm talking about here. And so, when I was holed up in my study, writing this book, and I have never written more easily or with more ease. Every word I used seemed newly minted, and newly minted for me. Just putting accents was a thrill, generating an ñ, an occasion for celebration. Every time I got lost inside one of those expansive periods of Spanish sentences, I relished the adventure. Somehow, I always found my way out. When I write in English, I write silently, hearing the words only in my head. Composing Spanish sentences, I found myself sounding out each word, reciting each sentence as I wrote or rewrote it. The pleasure was lingual rather than merely linguistic. It was tied to a tongue rather than to a language. What I felt was something like an acorde, a consonance, between my tongue and my ear, as if the two organs had been made for each other. I realized then that I was the mouth for my ears. If I wrote exilio, the word came alive in the saying. If I rewrote país, each letter was poised for vocalization. In Spanish, vowels are vocales, words are voces. I felt so comfortable in my mother tongue, so surprisingly at home in my home, that I wondered how I could have spent all those years in someone else's dwelling. Compared to Spanish, English offered bare accommodations, little more than 4 walls and a roof over my head. But Spanish was my homestead, somewhere I could settle for life. I swore to myself that I had written my last English sentence. Evidently, since I'm speaking to you in English today, I did not live up to my loyalty oath. Soon after finishing my Spanish book, I began to miss English. I began to miss words like miss. I began to miss words like word, so different from the Spanish palabra, which in English is only palaver. But my point is that, whatever the compensations, nostalgia for a lost or neglected language is one of the most enduring legacies of exile. And I'm not sure nostalgia, I don't think, is the right word or not the only word. What I mean is that the language, well, going back to psychoanalytic vocabulary, the language becomes, at least for me, Spanish has become cathected, more and more cathected as the years have gone by, more and more charged with feeling, charged with emotion. Linguists have this concept of certain kinds of words that they call tensors or intensives, I believe, like very, for example, or an exclamation mark. Well, for me, it's almost like every Spanish word has a very written in front of it or under it, or it comes with an invisible exclamation mark. And so it's nostalgia, but also a great deal of feeling for the language. In all the years that I have lived in the United States, there has not been a single day when I have not heard a word of English. But there have been many, many days when I have not heard a word of Spanish. Not long ago, I spent an afternoon going through a little book of Cubanismos, Cuban slang, a book that was published in Miami in the 1960s. It struck me that I hadn't heard many of these expressions since Miami in the 1960s. Then it occurred to me that I may never hear them again. And it's not just the words that I miss, que extraño, it's the people that came alive through them. Lose the words, lose the world. 20 years ago, there was nobody in my family with whom I did not speak in Spanish. Today, I speak in Spanish only with my mother. A few years from now, I will speak Spanish only with myself. We tend to think of the course of human life as circular, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But for exiles and immigrants, the course of our linguistic lives, let alone our other lives, the course of our linguistic lives is frequently not circular, for the sounds that cradled us at birth are not those that surround us as we grow old. And yet, somehow, our birth language never goes completely silent. It keeps ringing in our ear, in our inner ear, asking us to pick up and listen, sometimes even when we're not aware of it. And Bianciotto's writing once again provides a vivid illustration of this. Bianciotti has frequently, like other bilinguals, Bianciotti is very sensitive to sort of the nuances, the connotative nuances of words according to the language. And so he has often spoken of the changes that an object seems to undergo depending on the language that you name it in. And his favorite example are the French and Spanish words for bird. In French, and my French pronunciation is terrible, so forgive me, it's oiseau, O-I-S-E-A-U. And then in Spanish, pájaro. And in one of his novels, he says the following about the difference between oiseau, French for bird, and pájaro, Spanish for bird. He says, if I say oiseau, I notice that the vowels that surround the S, caressing it, evoke a warm, small creature with smooth and shining plumage, a creature that loves its nest. On the other hand, if I say pájaro, because of the accent on the first syllable, the Spanish bird flies through the air like an arrow. He adds that since he prefers closed spaces to open ones, the garden to the pampa, he is more like the French oiseau than like the Spanish pájaro. But consider now the title of one of Bianciotti's last books. This is a book published in 1999. And again, forgive my French. The title is Comme la trace de l'oiseau dans l'air, like the trace of the oiseau, of the bird in the air, or like the trace can be interpreted many different ways, as we know now. Trace, footprint, track, estela in Spanish. Okay, so it's like the track or the footprint of the bird in the air. Now, in the context of Bianciotto's comments about the difference between oiseau and pájaro, his title is something of an avian solecism, for he attributes to the oiseau the flightiness that he identifies with the pájaro, which pierces the air like an arrow. In other words, his French oiseau carries the trace, the footprint of the Spanish pájaro. So here we have, because if this were really a oiseau, he wouldn't be flying, it wouldn't be la trace de l'oiseau dans l'air, it wouldn't be flying through the air. Okay? So here we have a rare bird indeed, a French bird that behaves like a Spanish bird. That's why the title of the Spanish translation of the book, Como la huella de un pájaro en el aire, though literally exact, fails to capture the strangeness, the foreignness nestled in the French title. Because los pájaros are supposed to be flying through the air, right? As opposed to the oiseau, who are not. Sort of an equivalent title might be something like como el calor de un pájaro en su nido. No? That would be similarly foreign, because supposedly pájaro is not the one who stays in the nido, pájaro is the one who's flying through the air. Okay. Elsewhere in that same novel, Bianciotto states that the French language has, quote, dried up his Spanish like a vine that chokes the trunk of a tree. But with all due respect to Bianciotti, he's wrong again. However stressed and vine-ridden, that tree, the Spanish tree, is still yielding sap, and pájaros have built their nests in its branches. Whether he knows it or not, Spanish continues to ring in Bianciotto's ear. Inside his oiseau, there is a pájaro trying to get out. Frank Sinatra once said, memorably, "May the last voice you hear be mine." I'm not sure about Bianciotti, but I know that the old German deserter in his story would wish for himself a last voice that spoke to him in German, his mother tongue. The older we get, the less bilingualism is a political, social, or even linguistic issue, and the more it becomes a private affair, intimate theory. Don't ask me in which language I dream. My dreams speak in tongues, and they don't understand me. According to the poet Derek Walcott, to change your language, you must change your life. But the converse is also true. A change in your language brings about a change in your life, which is why the stakes of using one language rather than another increase as we age. I think that Bianciotti's refusal of Spanish after he turned 50, as well as my embrace of it at the same point in my life, both express the desire to grow old in the company of only one tongue, the desire to speak or write at last with a single voice, a voice not shadowed by other voices. I'm afraid, however, that this desire, like others, has to go unsatisfied. Once bilingual, always bilingual. We can change our lives and we can change our languages, but what we cannot do is recapture the time before our tongue was forked by other tongues. Riddled by nostalgia and remorse, the bilingual muse is a melancholy muse. It divides and does not conquer. And so the best we can hope for when we get old is that we don't become totally deaf to the sounds of our mother tongue, the sounds we heard before we knew there were other languages, other sounds, which is another way of saying, may the last voice you hear be yours. Thank you.